then we will move on swiftly to the second question, which we're going to be dealing with together with you, Nick. And it states that we have a tenant who has signed and agreed to an addendum outlining their responsibility for covering costs associated with the security company, right? The landlord then holds a binding 24-month contract with the designated security company. The tenant has now taken occupancy of the premises and expressed their desire to discontinue utilizing the services of that security company. Given then this development, who then bears the responsibility, Nick, for the potential cancellation fees associated with terminating the existing security contract? So that the viewer would really appreciate our insight and guidance with this regard.
Okay, so what's important to remember here is who the agreements, where agreements lie in the particular circumstances. The landlord has entered into an agreement with the security company, okay, to provide a certain service in respect of a particular premises. And in terms of that contract that exists between the landlord and the security company, okay, there are going to be certain provisions. And what we hear from the question is there is a certain provision which relates to early cancellation of the fixed term agreement. Okay, perfectly normal clause that exists in most agreements. We don't know what the terms of the particular contract are, but we know that there's a cancellation penalty of some kind. Okay, we won't deal with whether it's reasonable or not. There can be a cancellation penalty if you're going to cancel your agreement early. Okay. And so the person who's ultimately responsible in a circumstance where that contract is cancelled early, okay, is going to be the landlord, because they are the ones that had entered into the contract with the security company ultimately. Okay. What the landlord has done in this particular circumstances is, because the security services are being rendered in respect of a particular property, okay, they have passed the costs associated with the security company onto their tenant, okay, in terms of an addendum to the lease agreement, okay? And that's absolutely fine. You can do that as long as, you know, obviously the tenant agrees to those particular costs, in which case they've signed an addendum. So they're passing the costs associated with those security services onto the tenant. But that does not mean that they have been replaced, okay, or taken the position of the landlord in terms of the security contract. Okay, the landlord is still the party who's entered into the security contract at the end of the day, regardless of whether the tenant has to reimburse the landlord for the security services which have been paid. So the question is tricky, because ultimately, who is responsible for the cancellation penalty that will be rendered if the security contract is cancelled prematurely? The landlord. The landlord is the person who is in the contract, and they will be liable for it. And I want to press, you know, upon our writer, just because the tenant doesn't want to, you know, continue to pay for the security services, and they have suggested that there's a premature cancellation of the contract, does not mean that the landlord is obliged to actually cancel their contract early. They still ultimately have the decision in respect to the security services, and if there's an addendum which says that the tenant is going to reimburse, then the tenant must reimburse. But if they are inclined to cancel early on the say-so of the tenants in the circumstances, now we need to look at the terms of the particular addendum, because we know that the parties have entered into an addendum where in some way it is worded that the tenant is going to reimburse the landlord for security services rendered in respect to the premises. Now, does that clause include cancellation penalties that are rendered if the contract is terminated early? I don't know. It may well be that the addendum is worded in such a way that it says any charge which is rendered by security services in respect to the property, in which case, yes, you could interpret it and say, look, if there's a cancellation penalty, I'm still passing that on to you as the tenant. Or it might be worded in such a way where it's only the monthly fee, in which case it's not going to cover a cancellation penalty which the landlord might suffer, in which case the landlord is probably going to sit there and go, look, I'm not going to cancel this prematurely and take a hit, you know, because then ultimately I'm going to be liable. So really you'd have to look at the wording associated with the particular addendum that the parties have signed. It's very possible that it could be passed on to the tenants in the circumstances, but you would have to make sure that the wording does provide for that in the circumstances.
Right. Well, there you have it. Thank you very much, Nick. And that brings us to the end of our 2 questions and today's episode as well. Thank you, gentlemen. And we'll see everybody once again next week with more questions from our viewers. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Thanks.